Tonight, the Ruby Princess ordered to shore. The cruise ship docks in Port Kembla as authorities grapple with treating its crew. Good evening, I'm Juanita Phillips. This is ABC News. Extra COVID-19 testing to be rolled out in 13 hotspots across New South Wales. Former detective Gary Jubilant found guilty of making illegal recordings during the William Terrell investigation. And after 35 years, Commissioner Fitzsimmons leaves the Rural Fire Service.
And like everybody else, this season has changed me. I don't think you can actually get through a season like we've just experienced and not be affected.
An 84-year-old man in Perth has become the 12th person who was on board the Ruby Princess to die from coronavirus. His death takes the national toll to 40. The Ruby Princess has docked at Port Kembla, 100 kilometres south of Sydney. There are now 200 crew showing symptoms of the virus. Here's state political reporter Ashley Raper.
An early morning escort to dock, but not to disembark. The Ruby Princess was ordered into Port Kembla, and that's where it'll stay for now, after being stranded at sea for a fortnight.
The reason we need to dock it is because of the regular supplies that need to go on the ship. Taking sick crew passengers off at sea is a complex and dangerous task.
On board are more than 1,000 crew from 50 countries. They are now under police guard.
A plan has been developed that will be around isolation on the ship.
That plan came from an external medical company called on by Border Force. The crew must isolate in cabins for 10 days. There are close to 200 showing symptoms of coronavirus, but the number of confirmed cases isn't being released. Anybody too sick to stay on board will go to hospital.
I can give an absolute assurance to the people who live in that area, who are serviced by a local hospital, that part of the plan is making sure that we're distributing patients equally.
Some who live in the area came curious at the cruise ship's arrival, but they were quickly moved on by police and no doubt told to go home. Not all locals welcome its birth.
I'm bloody angry because this ship should have been located in Sydney Harbour, where the crew have access to health services and hospitals in the abundance.
The docking of the Ruby Princess coincides with the start of the criminal investigation into who's to blame for letting passengers off the ship when there was growing evidence of coronavirus on board. The probe was ordered by a premier under pressure and desperate to draw a line under this debacle.
Well, I think it's plainly obvious that something horribly wrong has happened. Of course that's obvious.
For the crew on the ship, plans are afoot to send them home once their isolation has finished. Ashley Raper, ABC News.
The ABC's Selby Stewart is at Port Kembla for us tonight. Selby, how do local medical professionals feel about the ship docking there?
Good evening, Juanita. Well, there's still some anticipation among local health professionals about exactly how this situation will play out over the next 10 days. On one hand, there are concerns that local hospitals may not be able to deal with a sudden influx of COVID-19 patients. But on the other hand, some local health professionals have taken to social media to try and reassure the community and let them know that they are prepared for such a scenario like this one. We have also heard tonight that the local health district says there are currently no Ruby Princess crew members at any hospitals in the region, and that those that may require hospitalisation in the coming days will primarily be transferred to hospitals across Sydney. So it's hopeful, Juanita, that will reduce the burden or ease the burden on the local health system.
Selby Stewart with the latest there from Port Kembla. While the rate of infections in New South Wales continues to slow, authorities have a new worry. They've identified 13 coronavirus hotspots, and those areas will now become the focus of extra testing.
The number of new coronavirus cases in New South Wales has again decreased, but the state's death toll continues to rise.
There are 2 new deaths that occurred yesterday in an 86-year-old man and an 85-year-old man.
The 86-year-old was a resident at the Opal Aged Care Centre in Bankstown, and the 85-year-old contracted the virus from a known case. He died in Liverpool Hospital. There are now 2,637 confirmed cases in New South Wales, including 57 new infections.
Which shows that the hard work everyone is doing, the hard work the health system is doing, and also the community in staying in isolation seems to be paying off.
453 cases are from unknown sources, prompting a new testing regime.
We want to encourage increased testing in those communities where we've seen even a few local cases of transmission.
Those communities are Broken Hill, Lake Macquarie, Manning, Port Macquarie, Byron, Waverley, Woollahra, Ryde, Macquarie Park, Dee Why, Manly, Nowra and South Nowra.
We're very concerned, particularly for rural hospitals. Many of them might only have one ventilator. We're concerned also about critical care drugs, equipment, and particularly personal protective equipment, which we know is in short supply.
Fever clinics have been set up and testing criteria broadened to include anyone experiencing respiratory symptoms like coughing, a sore throat or shortness of breath. The challenge will be keeping infection rates low in communities where there's been local transmissions, especially over the Easter break. Doctors want tough penalties on anyone caught travelling to regional areas or trying to cross borders.
We think more needs to be done to stop people moving. Some jurisdictions like the ACT have really locked it down and they made it illegal to travel on holidays over Easter, which we fully welcome.
The police strategy for tackling travel over Easter will be unveiled later this week. Lily Mayers, ABC News, Sydney.
The livelihoods of 6 million workers will be the only item for discussion when Parliament meets on Wednesday to debate a $130 billion wage subsidy scheme. Labor will support the package, but it's pushing for changes to ensure all casual workers are covered. Political editor Andrew Probyn reports.
Even charities need more than goodwill to operate.
We're building these packs so that people can have enough to eat throughout this crisis.
Hampers of pantry essentials collected and distributed to the needy by a sector in heavy demand.
Well, the conundrum is at a point where there is maximum demand for services, we're seeing a hit on our revenue sources, which are for our work as well as our donations.
Workers in the not-for-profit sector to be eligible for the $1,500 a fortnight JobKeeper payment if their employer's turnover has fallen by 15% or more. Relaxed criteria compared to the 30% required for most other businesses.
It's not a luxury, it's actually a necessity.
It's a modest extension of a $130 billion economic rescue package, one that's getting a wartime billing.
This is Parliament's Dunkirk moment. We get the lifeboats out and we save jobs, and we do it in the simplest, clearest, guaranteed formula that Parliament can devise.
But expanding access for charities is the only concession the government is prepared to make.
Even with expenditure of this extraordinary size, there have to be some definitions and some lines drawn.
Ruling out casuals receiving the payment unless they've had 12 months continuous work with the same employer, a decision that'll see more than 1 million workers miss out.
In previous downturns, many people, when they've lost the relationship with the employer, many people never return to work again.
Labor will support the wage subsidy despite its concerns. The government says workers who don't qualify for JobKeeper will instead receive the Job Seeker allowance, which is effectively double the old New Start. If this argument proves one thing, it's that winding back unemployment benefits once the crisis passes will be very difficult. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
While the number of new cases of coronavirus has dropped in Australia over the past week, the death toll has doubled. And as Casey Briggs explains, the number of fatalities isn't expected to slow for some time yet.
We've now seen 40 COVID-19 related deaths across Australia. The rate of deaths is increasing. 5 were recorded yesterday. Today, another 5 as more and more people develop serious infections. There are almost 100 people now in intensive care. Some positive signs though, 104 cases were recorded today across the country, and that is the smallest increase in almost 3 weeks. It puts us on a much better trajectory in Australia than a country like the US, where cases are increasing rapidly. So why haven't we declared victory over this pandemic yet? Well, one reason is the drop-off in new cases corresponds with a drop drop-off in international arrivals since the borders closed a few weeks ago. Also, rates of testing have been down, and that's why doctors are now being encouraged to more broadly test people in the community, looking for local transmission that we don't yet know about. It'll be interesting to see where our trajectory goes once the testing broadens, to see if it continues to look a little bit like South Korea, which has been testing broadly from the start.
A former homicide detective has been found guilty of misconduct while leading the investigation into the disappearance of William Terrell. Gary Jubilan used his mobile phone to illegally record conversations with a key suspect on the New South Wales Mid-North Coast. The magistrate described Jubilan as a self-serving witness who gave speeches instead of answering questions about his illegal behaviour. Crime reporter Mark Reddy.
Dressed in black and white every step of the way, but the criminal case against this former homicide detective was anything but, although today the verdict was clear.
Obviously, I'm disappointed by the decision of the court.
Gary Jubilan was found guilty of misconduct charges related to his handling of the William Terrell investigation.
Given the fact I've been putting people before the court for the past 32 years, it's important that I respect the decision.
For years, Paul Savage was a person of interest linked to the boy's disappearance from the New South Wales Mid-North Coast.
I'm concerned about the lies that you're telling.
I'm not lying to you.
Police had warrants when they bugged his Kendall home, but the court heard those listening devices would often fail. So Gary Jubilan used his mobile phone to record conversations with Paul Savage, but there was no warrant. I don't accept that he knew he was being listened to. Mr. Savage said he didn't like to be treated that way. As such, he didn't give consent. That's unshaken. He didn't know.
I thought I had a lawful reason to record the conversations.
His fixation with Mr. Savage raised eyebrows from the magistrate. There is no evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no leads. There is nothing. He has picked Mr. Savage, pursuing him at all costs. The magistrate slammed Gary Jubilan for the way he relentlessly pursued Paul Savage, saying his strategy was above and beyond legality. He described his evidence as untenable and unbelievable, saying Jubilan was the only one who controlled the chess pieces during the course of the investigation. Coronavirus restrictions meant his family and supporters were kept outside court for the ruling. Gary Jubilan lived and breathed the investigation with absolute commitment to finding out what happened to William.
The matter's back in the court on Wednesday,
when he faces a maximum penalty of 5 years behind bars. Mark Reddy, ABC News, Sydney.
He's the man who was at the helm of the RFS during the state's worst bushfires. Now Shane Fitzsimmons is moving on. He'll be heading up a new disaster agency called Resilience New South Wales. He spoke to the ABC's bushfire recovery reporter, Philippa McDonald.
Like everybody else, this season has changed me. I don't think you can actually get through a season like we've just experienced and not be affected by it in some way. And that profound impact really came home when we saw so much loss of life. Just under 2,500 homes destroyed, livelihoods, livestock, agricultural assets, infrastructure, community assets. No matter how you tally up the statistics, behind every one of those little data sets are people.
What will be two of your priority areas?
So right now we know that recovery is the single biggest focus. We've already got massive efforts and operation underway as a result of the droughts and the bushfires and some of the localised flooding event. And for many people in New South Wales, they've been compounded by all of those.
Another layer of bureaucracy or a sign that the government is unable or ill-equipped to cope with this recovery at the moment?
I don't think that's fair. I think one of my tasks that I'm very conscious of in this new role is that how do we make it easier and simpler for people that have been devastated, that have been dislocated from their normal life, that have lost everything. How do we make it easier for them to access and know what's available, what they might be entitled to, and how they can get that as effortlessly and as quickly and as simply as possible.
You pulled the Prime Minister in line when he didn't let you know that the Army were being deployed in New South Wales. Are you going to have that strength and that resolve to do those sort of things in the future?
I will absolutely be taking on board everything that people are looking for and needing, but I'll also be making sure my views and thoughts are known on what's happening, why it's happening, and most importantly, how we can do better for the people of New South Wales.
Still to come this hour, Dr. Norman Swan talks to the experts racing to develop a coronavirus vaccine.
The new technologies are really focusing the immune response at the very particular part of the virus that we know is going to inactivate the virus and prevent it from replicating.
We see the vaccine as being a critical part of getting Australians to go back to their normal way of life.
Also, the social media network giving hard-pressed health workers a helping hand. That's coming up.
In the United States, the coronavirus crisis is being compared to Pearl Harbor and the 9/11 terror attacks, with Americans warned the next week of the pandemic could be the toughest in living memory. The number of cases stands at a staggering 337,000, representing a quarter of all infections worldwide. Almost 10,000 Americans have died, many of them in New York City. North America correspondent James Glenday reports.
The city that never sleeps is completely shut down, and a field hospital is now up and running in picturesque Central Park.
You pain anywhere? No. No?
They're preparing for the pandemic to peak here in the coming days. 594 people died in this state in the past 24 hours, down from 630 yesterday, though most fear the worst is still to come.
The next week is going to be our Pearl Harbor moment. It's going to be our 9/11 moment. It's going to be the hardest moment for many Americans in their entire life.
In Brooklyn, there are so many bodies, they're being stacked in makeshift morgues.
We all know that we have to reach a certain point, and that point is going to be a horrific point in terms of death, but it's also a point at which things are going to start changing.
For Australians, Christopher Hugh and his partner Amelia Banks, it's a scary experience.
This is the view from our balcony, and this is one of the main streets that runs through Williamsburg and Brooklyn.
They arrived 6 weeks ago, but their life is not quite what they thought it would be.
At night, there's a constant stream of sirens which pierce the air. I think the last few nights, it's woken us up. So, that's become the new normal, but the new normal isn't normal at all.
In the Bronx, even a tiger at a zoo has been diagnosed with COVID-19. Next door, in New Jersey, the death toll is rising rapidly, and New Orleans is becoming a hotspot too, while locals in Florida continue to be concerned about the arrival of infected cruise ships. There are also worries here about the growing number of cases in and around Washington, D.C. Today, the White House confirmed it's already beginning to dispatch thousands of military medics to parts of the country that need help most. James Glenday, ABC News, Washington.
The British Prime Minister has spent a night in hospital suffering from persistent coronavirus symptoms. More than 10 days after testing positive, Boris Johnson still has a high temperature. He was admitted to hospital in London as the Queen gave a rare televised speech invoking a spirit of wartime. Europe correspondent Linton Besser reports.
Boris Johnson was last seen in public clapping for Britain's health service.
Okay, thanks, NHS, thank you.
Today, he's a patient.
You need to be quite forceful.
Quite forceful?
Yeah.
Yep.
Before the Prime Minister announced he was positive 10 days ago, he visited laboratories developing new tests and shook hands with coronavirus victims. He's been admitted to hospital as a precautionary measure, not for emergency treatment. From Windsor Castle, the Queen made a rare national address.
Together we are tackling this disease, and I want to reassure you that if we remain united and resolute, then we will overcome it.
Warm weather in Britain brought many people outside. Police were patrolling, separating people when they were getting too close. Sunbathing in parks prompted warnings from the British Health Secretary that outdoor exercise could be banned.
Number 8, isolate. Number 8.
Bingo on the streets of Dublin brought joy to some residents. And street dancing brought out the young and old. Many Italians are struggling to live without money and are becoming dependent on handouts from strangers. Health officials, though, are starting to feel optimistic, with the daily death toll at its lowest in 2 weeks. They say the curve that was plateauing is starting to go down. The number of deaths in Spain is also dropping. With the death toll expected to surge past 5,000 today, the worsening of Boris Johnson's condition will be a wake-up call. Perhaps even more powerful than the Queen's address will be the uncertainty about who is running this country. Linton Besser, ABC News, London.
A coronavirus outbreak has been confirmed on board a cruise ship anchored off the coast of Uruguay. Nearly 100 Australians are among those stranded on the Greg Mortimer Antarctic ship. Officials in Montevideo have refused to let it dock due to the number of people with symptoms. Now, 81 passengers and crew have tested positive and results are pending for 90 more. Aurora Expeditions, the company that runs the ship, says it's trying to get people back home as soon as possible. A powerful cyclone has torn through the Pacific, killing 5 people who were swept from a ferry in the Solomon Sea. Tens of thousands of people are now bunkering down in Vanuatu. They've been forced to abandon social distancing practices in the face of the Category 5 storm.
Heavy rains and winds of more than 200 kilometres an hour. Cyclone Harold is battering Vanuatu. The Category 5 storm destroyed homes and buildings as it made landfall in Espiritu Santo, the country's largest island.
Could please pray for people here in Santo. We've got 200 people in our evacuation centre.
Police and army spent the weekend trying to move vulnerable people to safer areas. A state of emergency is already in place in Vanuatu because of COVID-19, even though no cases have been confirmed yet. Restrictions on public gatherings have been lifted to allow people to go to evacuation centres. The weather system began forming near Australia's Cape York Peninsula before developing into a tropical cyclone as it moved past the Solomon Islands, where it wreaked havoc. 5 people are dead and 22 are missing at sea after they were swept overboard from a ferry that left the capital Honiara in bad conditions. The storm became more powerful as it moved towards Vanuatu. The Australian government has given the Solomon Islands almost $100,000 in immediate emergency funding in response to Cyclone Harold. There's yet to be an announcement about possible support for Vanuatu.
I think this just hampers their efforts in getting the messages out for COVID-19.
The coronavirus was already stretching resources in the region. Now they'll have a natural disaster to recover from as well. Natalie Whiting, ABC News.
Many students with disabilities say they're struggling with homeschooling as the coronavirus pandemic continues. They say they're having problems with technology and a lack of one-on-one guidance. It's also a huge challenge for parents who are often trying to do their own work while helping their children do theirs.
For Ben Mavlian, who lives with autism, learning from home is proving difficult.
The downside is when you need to be in a class and do Zoom meetings, it's very hard to get those Zoom meetings to work, and you can also have technical problems.
The Year 12 student says the lack of support can be a challenge.
Probably somebody to be around and to help me when I'm struggling.
His mum is a teacher and feels like she's playing catch-up at night to support him and her 3 other children.
Having to work and then come home and check on how the kids are going, and particularly Benjamin with his the level of help that he needs, it's really, really challenging to juggle both of those.
We'll have to log into that one.
Gina Wilson-Burns agrees. She's working as well as educating 16-year-old Mac, who lives with a physical disability and vision impairment.
It is a struggle. There's no way of getting around that. And the reality is what's had to give in this instance is Mac's education.
And that's concerning advocates.
We know that students with disability already find it hard enough to access inclusive education, yet we don't want them further discriminated against in their education throughout this period.
To help with that, resources have been created to support parents and students with a disability. It's aimed at making learning fun and accessible.
The video one you handed in.
Resources that will better prepare parents.
It's really difficult to get your head around all the curriculum and how parents can help their children to access that, and I think that's something that parents would definitely need more support with.
Support she's hoping will come in Term 2. Naz Campanella, ABC News.
The Attorney-General Christian Porter has called on the AFP Commissioner to start disciplinary proceedings against federal police recruits who were caught breaching physical distancing rules in Canberra. The ABC obtained video of AFP trainees partying at their residential college in Barton, moments before ACT police broke up the event. The Attorney-General says the matter should be investigated further.
It doesn't sound very good. And it sounds like that should definitely be a matter of disciplinary proceedings for the Commissioner with his recruits, which I am sure he will engage in a robust fashion.
The ABC has contacted the AFP for comment. In finance news, the local share market managed a gain of more than 4%. Here's Alan Kohler.
Well, the share market surged 4.2% today, getting it back to where it was on Wednesday last week, and actually also back to where it was in the middle of March. The share market has stabilised over the past couple of weeks following the 20% rally from March the 23rd. Volatility is still quite high, of course, but at least it's bouncing sideways at the moment. Today's gains were led by banks and miners, but there were a few really big rises like Magellan Financial, Altium and BlueScope Steel. Asian markets also did well, even though stocks in New York fell on Friday, weighed down by a very grim employment report for March. 700,000 jobs were lost in the United States in the month, with unemployment up from 3.5 to 4.4%. But with 10 million people having filed for the dole over the past 2 weeks, most reckon that the rise in US unemployment has a long way to go yet. And the great majority of those job losses in March were in hospitality, which was the first to be affected by the coronavirus shutdowns, as it was here. There was some good news over the weekend, well, sort of good anyway. The oil price surged almost 20% because first Donald Trump tweeted that he thought that OPEC and Russia were talking again and production cuts would be agreed, and then Russia's President Putin confirmed it. But given that oil demand has collapsed by 20 million barrels a day because air travel has fallen 70%, it's hard to see how they can cut production enough to keep the price up. The Australian dollar dipped below 60 US cents on Friday night, but recovered a little as the US dollar fell after those employment numbers. And that's finance.
Time for the weather now with Lara Hyams. And Lara, that wet weather that some areas had on the weekend, that was pretty short-lived.
Well, it's looking fairly clear at the moment. We are beginning to see a drop in the temperatures now, but for today, Sydney did get to a top of 25 degrees. That was fairly consistent throughout. Our minimum temperatures were slightly below average, the Snowy Mountains recording the coolest temperatures. Meanwhile, our maximums were generally above average. That's thanks to, or below average, thanks to some of that cool air that was associated with the weekend cold fronts. The northern coastal regions recording the highest temperatures. Now, most of the cloud that we're seeing is around Western Australia. That is going to make its way into South Australia. There is some low cloud too around Tasmania and the Alpine regions, which brought some decent falls. A high pressure system in the Bight, though, is bringing dry conditions elsewhere. Now, the ridge of high pressure is quite dominant, but the low off the southeast, this has moved off the coast, so those windy conditions have eased. However, the onshore winds are leading to hazardous surf conditions for a lot of the state, and there is a warning in place until tomorrow. Around the capital cities, we'll see some cloudy conditions expected for Brisbane, also for Melbourne and Hobart, mostly sunny in Adelaide, sunny for Perth and cloudy for Darwin. Now, overnight, most of the falls were in the Snowy Mountains, but on the radar now, it's looking fairly clear. Likely to have the odd shower just around the south coast and some of the onshore flow, bringing moisture as well to the northern coastal fringe, and that could trigger some light falls in the region. In the north, cloudy conditions and some light showers are expected. Not a big drop in temperatures for this time of year, but there will be some cooler starts for the morning. On the waters, southwesterly winds up to 20 knots, seas up to 2.5 metres. Further south, a mostly cloudy day. There is going to be a slight chance of a shower, slightly below temperatures though. On the waters, southerly winds reaching 20 knots, and we could see some of those seas get up to 1.5 metres. Partly cloudy for a lot of the interior. We'll see some of the temperatures get between 7 and also the low 20s. On Sydney waters, southerly winds will get up to about 20 knots and seas at about 1.5 metres. The cloudy conditions will continue and we will start to have some mild temperatures throughout. Further south will be a little bit cooler. We'll get to a top of 22 degrees. This will be for the city and the west. We'll see sunrise at 6:11 in the morning. And looking ahead, we'll start to see a change from about Wednesday. That's when we'll see some light showers come through. There will be a cold front that will begin to move through. Warmer temperatures, though, expected in the west.
Thanks for that, Lara. Stay with us now. Lee Sales is here with 7:30.